Hello, fine students at BYU. I'm happy to be here again by time travel techniques. And I'm happy to discuss for you the concepts of philosophy that I was able to formulate when I was alive. I'd like to begin with a discussion of my mentor, Socrates, one of the greatest men who ever lived, in my opinion. The heart of Socrates' teaching was the unexamined life is not worth living. He spent most of his time encouraging citizens of Athens to examine their own lives. And he looked at his own life and was not above any kind of self-criticism. When he walked around the city of Athens, he would stop a person on the street, ask them what they were doing, inquire of them certain fundamental questions regarding their own life and their own profession. And he would then ask for answers. The answers would come back, and he would ask again. That back and forth question and answer system is called the Socratic method, also known as the didactic method. And he did that searching for the ultimate nature of various qualities. For instance, he might ask a person who is in the military, what is duty? Or a person who is religious, what is truth? He might ask a person who is supposedly ethical, what is evil or what is ethical. Because this is such an important technique and has been used for searching truth ever since the days of Socrates, I'd like to carry out this Socratic method with someone. Is there a person here who would be willing to volunteer to come up and participate with me in the Socratic method? Who out there? Yes, please, come right up here. Thank you. Come stand up here by me. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. Stand right up here. Tell me your name.
Julie?
Julie. And your major?
Nursing?
Nursing. How did I guess? All right. Julie, tell me what's the most important part of nursing, the quality that all nurses have to have more than anything else.
Empathy.
Empathy. Ah, very good. A Greek word. I love it. Now tell me what empathy means.
Empathy means not just feeling sorry for someone, but understanding their point of view and then helping them.
Understanding their point of view and then helping them. All right, let me ask you a couple of questions about that. Would that be okay? If you want to understand somebody's point of view, how do you find out what that point of view is?
You talk to them and see what emotions you find in what they're saying.
Okay. What if the person is sick and they don't quite know how to express themselves? That, they're in terrible pain. Maybe you ask them a question and all they can think about is how they're hurting. How do you find the empathy there?
Well, it makes it harder, but sometimes you just kind of have to look underneath whatever outward pain or distress they might be in and try and see the truth of their situation.
Okay, so you don't look immediately at the outside necessarily, but you try and search within and try and find what's within the person. Yep. Now, how long have you been a nurse?
Well, I'm actually only 3/4 of a nurse.
Okay.
But I have been in nursing school. This is my 3rd year in nursing school.
All right. Now, do you think that it's easy to search below the surface and get in and find out?
No, it's not easy.
Not easy. A lot of work. Do you think you're going to be an expert in that as soon as you become a nurse?
Nope.
Then what you'll have to do is develop the skill of empathy over a period of time. Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, before you develop that skill of empathy, if that's the most important thing, then are you going to be worthwhile as a nurse?
Because you start from some place, and it's the journey of making it to that increased empathy that
Okay.
makes nursing such an interesting profession, I think.
But if you fail to recognize the empathy and this person gets sicker and dies, then in a way you've kind of killed the person, isn't that right?
Yeah, I guess so, but it's
So nursing is teaching you how to kill people?
well, that's why we have nursing school, so that we can kill mannequins instead of real people.
You can kill mannequins. Oh, well, that's good. I'm glad that mannequins have a life and death. That's good.
I accidentally killed one once. It was sad.
It was sad.
It was sad.
All right, very good. Thank you very much for your help. One of the key things that Socrates also taught, in addition to an investigation of this inner quality that everyone should possibly have, is that knowledge is intuitive and is merely revealed by learning. Everybody is smart. Everybody understands much, much more than they would think. This fine young lady who was up here as a prospective nurse really does understand much more about empathy than perhaps the nursing school would even suggest that she knows. So I would like to demonstrate this example of how knowledge is so intuitive by looking at the Pythagorean theorem. And to do that, I need another volunteer. Is there a non-science, non-engineering, non-technology major who would be willing to come up and participate in this study? Yes, please, come right up. Why don't you stand right here this time? Now, what's your name?
Joseph,
Joseph, and what's your major?
business management.
Business management, certainly. Just out of the light here a little bit, all right? Now, I want you to look up at this. And the Pythagorean's theorem, go ahead, you read that.
The Pythagorean theorem states that the square area defined by length A plus the square area defined by length B equals the square area divided by length C.
Okay, so what it really says is that length, which corresponds to that square area, you got that? And that length, which corresponds to that square area, equals the square of that length, which corresponds to that big area.
Right.
So that area plus that area equals that area. That's what that thing says, isn't it?
Right.
Okay? Now, all I've done here is separate them out into hollows so that we can see a little better what's going to happen.
Okay.
Now, do you understand that if I can take that and that and put it in that, then we've shown it, haven't we?
Right.
All right, so let's do that. We'll start off, and you notice I put the blue one down inside the red one. You okay with that?
Yeah.
And what did I do with the green one?
Put it off the side.
Okay, but I put it off to the side with a little bit inside, right?
Right.
Okay, now what did I do?
You broke it down.
Broke it down, and what did I break down?
Then
Just the part outside, right?
right.
Okay,
So you fit it inside.
now what did I do with that?
Put it inside.
Stuck it up there, so it's got part inside. Now what did I do?
Broke it off.
Now what did I do?
Put it in.
Now what did I do?
Broke it off.
Now what did I do?
Put it in.
And what do we find?
Uh,
There's none left over, and it
True.
completely filled that square. So what's the conclusion?
Pythagoras was correct.
Pythagoras was correct, and you are too. Therefore, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Thank you very much. Let's hear it for him. Let me summarize exactly what we have shown. We have shown that anyone with a little education can be a genius. Now, why have I shown this? Because many of you don't think that you can learn everything. That's not true. Everyone can learn everything. Maybe a little harder, but you can learn everything. Just takes time, patience, little skill development, you'll be just there. It's like being left-handed or right-handed. If you were right-handed and something happened to your right arm and you could not write, eventually you would develop the skill to write with your left hand. You'd all be able to do it. And that's the way it is here. There is no subject that is impossible to learn by everyone. So why are some subjects harder than others? Why is that? Who would like to answer that question for me? Yes, please.
If you're not interested in it, you're not going to have the desire to learn it.
So one of the reasons that a subject might be harder or less is because you don't have the passion for the subject. Excellent answer. Yes, on the far side.
You don't have the perceived competence. If it's not something you're innately skilled at, and if you don't feel like you're competent in it at all, your desire to work for it will be less.
Okay, so your desire would be less, but what you're saying is that you need a basic level of competence to move into it. And therefore, to develop that competence, it might take a little bit of time. Excellent. Yes?
Most people like things that they're naturally good at. So if you're gifted at something and you have a natural aptitude for it, then you'll tend to want to learn that, and it'll come more easily.
Okay, so we all have different gifts, and you may or may not have a gift in that particular area, and you say you're not so good at tennis, but with a little practice you could get better. And you could certainly learn the game well enough to play at least reasonably. Excellent. Yes?
It depends on your basic knowledge level. If you have very little exposure to something, you'll tend to know or not have a very good foundation for understanding it. We'll have to start with something we know before we can move on to things we don't know.
So experience and all of that kind of stuff, yes. And I want you to think about something here as we're talking. Do you know that you've already commented on two different facets of your brain? Experience, skill, all of those things are about the left side of the brain. And passion and intuition, they're about the right side of the brain. So what we're really saying is that to learn something takes left and right brain capabilities, and you may be lacking in either the right brain or the left brain with respect to a particular subject, but with a little bit of work, you can build yourself up in right brain and left brain and become expert in that field. There was one more comment back here. Yes?
I was going to say that some people are naturally more analytical, while others are,
And I think that's exactly what you're saying. Some people are more analytical naturally, just as some people are more right-handed or left-handed naturally, and therefore they favor that one side. Yes, last question here.
I wanted to ask, do we have a general capacity to learn almost everything more easily early on? Like, I've heard that, you can learn language faster when you're just learning to talk. Can we learn everything more easily when we're younger as opposed to when we get older?
That is clearly true. Your brain is more capable of forming these subtle connections the younger you are. And as you get older, you can imagine how difficult it is for me. I am now 3,000 years old. It's somewhat difficult to form these new patterns. All right, so we've talked about right brain, left brain, and the implications of Socrates' idea for being creative. What are those implications? You can all be creative. That's exactly right. Everybody can be creative. Socrates was quoted in my book, The Apology, according to the following. I am called wise, for my hearers always imagine that I myself possess the wisdom which I find wanting in others. But the truth is, O men of Athens, that God only is wise, and by his answer he intends to show that the wisdom of men is worth little or nothing. He is not speaking of Socrates, he is only using my name by way of illustration, as if he said, O men, he is the wisest who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. What happened one day is that I had begun to develop this gadfly personality of going around and asking people questions. And so people assumed that I was quite wise, and I told them that that wasn't necessarily so. But someone went to the God's temple at Delphi, and there they inquired of the god Apollo who was the wisest person in Athens. And the answer was given, it is Socrates. I didn't believe it. And therefore I went around Athens looking for the wisest person. And what I found is that those people were not wise. And I came to the conclusion that I probably was the wisest. Not because I knew more, except in one area. They all thought they knew, and I knew that I didn't know, and therefore I was wiser than they. My gadfly nature resulted in a charge by the people in the city of Athens. That charge was corrupting the youth and not accepting the traditional gods. Therefore, in a public trial, they condemned Socrates to death. I was standing there when he took the hemlock, walked around, became tired, lost feeling in his feet and then his legs, and then finally he laid down and died. He was one of the wisest and most noble men to have ever lived. I'm glad that I can claim to be one of his students. I would like to give you a message from Socrates. And I know that this is especially important for BYU students. I've been here in the past. I get to travel every year by time to come to BYU and discuss this with you. So here is deep philosophy from Socrates. My advice is to get married. If you find a good wife, you'll be happy. If not, you'll become a philosopher. Now let's talk about the concepts that I was able to learn as I developed beyond my tutelage by Socrates. One of the things that I most readily understood is that our senses often deceive us. Have you experienced that yourselves? Maybe it's some phenomena that you see in nature, a mirage. Maybe it's some optical illusion. Something like this, perhaps. Are those lines, are the horizontal lines parallel or do they slope? They are parallel. But surely they look like they slope, don't they? So our senses are at this very moment deceiving us. Well, if our senses deceive us in a case like this, how do we know when our senses might be deceiving us in some other case? And the answer is, of course, we don't know. We have no idea when our senses might be deceiving us. Here's another one. How many legs does the elephant have? Can you count them? Looks like 5, 4, who knows? All right. Is the pencil straight, or as it enters the water, does the pencil bend? Because our senses occasionally deceive us, they lead only to opinions, not knowledge. And my quest today with you is to discover the nature of true knowledge, not opinions. Therefore, can we all conclude that whatever information comes to us through our senses, although it might be real, we can't tell for sure. And therefore, the best we can say about it is that we have an opinion that it might be real. But there is no absolute certainty. Do you all agree with that? Those who agree, please raise your hands. Okay, those who don't agree, raise your hands. All right, there are many who are not voting. Let's all vote, every 100%. those who agree that your senses might occasionally fool you? Raise your hands. Okay, that's a little better. But even though your senses may fool you, there is an underlying truth. That pencil that went into the water, it either was bent or it was not bent. But whichever it was, there is a fundamental underlying truth. All of you who agree that there is some fundamental underlying truth, raise your hands. Okay, there is the way it is, period. It is the way it is. Therefore, the heart of my philosophy is this. What is the real nature of things? That is, the fundamental or the truth. You remember last week, Dr. Strong told me that you discussed the fundamental in Greek science. People search for the fundamental. Today, we want to discover what that fundamental is. What is this? Who is a math major? Or a major related to mathematics? You know? Okay, yell out for us what that is. A right triangle. And how do you know it's a right triangle? Because this angle right here is shown as being a 90-degree angle. And that's the definition of a right triangle. Is that angle exactly 90 degrees? It's only a representation. Is it possible to draw a perfect 90-degree angle? Probably not. You may get close, but it would just be by chance. Do you all agree? Just be by chance. No matter how carefully you drew it, if you go to higher and higher levels of magnification, there may be some point at which the pencil skipped one molecule or something that made it so it's not exactly, precisely, perfectly 90 degrees. There is some deviation from perfection. Everybody agree with that? So if that is not an absolute perfect 90-degree angle, then only the form of 90 degrees is true. And what I mean by the form, I want everybody to stop for a second and think about what I'm going to say here. This is the heart of discovering truth. The form is that theoretical 90 degrees that does exist in perfection. Remember, we all said the pencil is either straight or bent. There was an underlying truth. There is, in the realm of forms, a perfect 90 degrees. And we know that that form exists because theoretically, we can recognize a true 90-degree angle. Everybody with me? The Pythagorean theorem, then, is only true when it's exactly 90 degrees. Therefore, the Pythagorean theorem is true only in theory, but not in physical actuality. But it is true in theory. We proved it. We proved it. So it's true in theory, but it is not true in actual physical cases. Here's another example of something. Here we have a right triangle, and here you can see the red square, or the red triangle move down, the little rectangular kind of shape here, yellow thing moved down, the green thing moved down, and that green triangle up on top moved down. And yet, here you see there's no white space, and down here we've gained the hole. How did we do that? How did we get that hole? That is that, that is that, that is that, that is that. Count the squares, you'll see them. Count the squares. How did that happen? Who'd like to tell me?
The two triangles aren't exactly the same. They have a different slope.
The two triangles aren't similar. Are you telling me that I've tried to trick you? Yes. Did I fool your senses? Not mine. Not yours. Good man. It's true, see? That slope right there is not the same as that slope right there. You see the little square up there? If you take all of that and sum it all up, you get one square. Okay. Would a volunteer, maybe someone who has some experience in English, is there an English major here? Anybody in English? Anybody in the humanities? Would one of you agree to read would you do that for me? I want you, okay, real loud. Come on up here. Come on up here. I want you to read this for me. What's your name? Marissa. All right, now I'm going to put a thing up there and you read it in a loud voice so everybody can hear. All right?
Okay.
This is a reading test.
According to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be at the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Amazing, huh?
Thank you. Ah, that's terrific. That is amazing, isn't it? We are used to looking at imperfection in this world, and we get along just fine. We are used to having the world imperfect, and we smooth it over. We take care of it. Our brains go around the obstacles, and we survive. We get along just fine. Just like that paragraph. We're able to do it in spite of physical or actual imperfections. What makes this a chair? Who'd like to answer that for me? Somebody out there tell me why that's a chair? Yes, why is it a chair? Because you can sit on it. You watch what I'm doing here, right? Does that make this a chair? Are you telling me that everything that I sit on becomes a chair? I sat on this. Does that make that a chair? No. There's a back to it. Now, if I sit right there with this as a back, does that make this floor bench combination a chair? And elevated. Well, now, if I sat on somebody's lap, and does that make it a chair? Is that a chair? Yeah. Is that a chair? Yeah. Is that a chair? All of these have a very important property. Chairness. They all have chairness. Now, what chairness is the form of a chair. Now, you're all going to laugh a little bit when I say chairness, but let me just look at everybody in the room and say, I believe that all of you have the form that we call humanness. Everybody's different. Everybody's got different size and somewhat different shapes, but you've all got the form of humanness. Is that okay? Therefore, we all recognize each other as humans. And that's the way it is with chairs. We recognize chairness. The reason is because before we came to this earth, we went to the realm of forms. And we saw what forms were like. So that now when we come to this earth, we recognize memory, we remember forms. And as we do that, we recognize that form in what we see around us. Now, some of you have experienced an even more subtle kind of form. It is the form of love. These abstract quantities also have forms. And when we see a person that we are drawn to because of their beauty or because of their good feeling that they bring to us or because of the service that we give and we develop this feeling, we begin to love them. And that love is something that we remember from the realm of forms, and we recognize it in the person that we love, and therefore we've developed this beautiful relationship. It is not about physical intimacy or passion. It is not physical. The form is not physical. In fact, if the form were physical, if you think the form is physical, it would change. It would be imperfect. It would not be true. Because all physical things, as we've already discussed, are imperfect. But the true, perfect form of love can be real. So, the word chair represents all chairs. So the form for chair is similar to the idea we get from the word. Notice that there is a word form in information. That's where we call it information, because it contains the form. Think about humanness. Part of what makes you, you, is information. We call that information DNA. We call it DNA. Now, I know this is difficult for most of you to understand. Therefore, many years ago when I was alive, I wrote an allegory called the Allegory of the Cave. I'd like to now show you a video clip of the Allegory of the Cave.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves, and they are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day, a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals, and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that the prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the freed prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With his new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
What have we discovered? The allegory here is that the world that we live in is the cave. And the things that we touch and feel are merely the shadows. The real truth lies not in the physical world around us, but in the world outside of our comprehension, outside of our ability to see, maybe even outside of our ability to think about, unless somehow we are given clues that there is an outside world. And the person who gives us those clues is the one who has somehow found his or her way to that outside world, to the world of forms. And that outside world is reality, while we live only in the world of shadows and imperfection. So, what are the shadows? It is the physical world that we perceive. What are the real things? The forms that are not perceived with our physical senses, but understood only intellectually. Only as the philosopher can comprehend them. Therefore, we see a hierarchy of values. The lowest value, that thing that is least permanent, is memory. Then, somewhat more permanent, but still not very permanent, is the physical world around us. And then, the mental, contemplative, mathematical world. We see that as being more permanent, more sure. And finally, the world of the forms. That unchanging world where perfection resides and where, upon contemplation, we can understand the true nature of things. That leads us to a very interesting question, and one of the purposes of my life was to help governments. I wrote a book called The Republic, where we discussed the ideal society, that perfect situation where people could progress in harmony and happiness. And so the question became, who would be the leaders of this perfect society? Now think for yourself through a couple of these situations. Think about a ship, the ship of state, if you wish. Should we let common people take turns being the captain? No, it's foolhardy. We don't want to risk the ship of state in the hands of some novice. He could run us into an iceberg. Even worse, should we make decisions on how to steer the ship by voting? Should we vote for whether we go right or left? No, it's ludicrous. Should we not rather choose a captain, as captain, someone who has studied navigation and sailing, has a knowledge? Of course, the kind of government that chooses the best person to be the leader is called a meritocracy. That's part of that best system. Let's take another case. A physician. Should we treat somebody by voting? That young lady who was the nurse. Should we treat somebody by voting? No, we shouldn't do that. Should we find someone who has the knowledge? What about in the state then? We should have a meritocracy. We should have knowledge, or we should elect those with knowledge in politics, and those people are the ones who understand the forms, who understand reality. That is, the well-educated. So, the meritocracy of our state should be led by those who know, understand at a very deep level. To find those people, we will administer tests to very young children. And those children who develop the capability of analysis, we will pull them out and give them special training. And as they become more skilled in searching for the forms, we will reward them. And those who demonstrate an incapability of discovering the forms will simply be returned to general society. Eventually, by this process of winnowing, we will find those who are truly skilled in discovering truth, who are skilled in discovering the world of the forms, and we will teach those people how to be the best leaders. And therefore, through this process of intelligent selection, we will come to the best rulers of our society. Does that not make sense? It's better than voting for anybody who happens to come along just because they've got a smiling face and a good PR system. All right. Now let's talk about how the world was created. It leads us directly into something you might be asking. How did we get this physical world? It began with a being called the demiurge, who is near godlike, who can form things in near perfection. Sadly, the demiurge did not have perfect matter to use in forming the physical world. The reason is there is no such thing as perfect matter. All matter is transitional, all matter changes, all matter is imperfect. Therefore, he used the designs of the forms as a blueprint, but used existing matter, physical matter, as the way in which the world was created. As a result, what we have is an imperfect world, although the resemblance to the forms is very close. Now, in actual fact, the demiurge did not physically touch the matter. There were others who worked with the demiurge to do that. The demiurge, therefore, gave a creation in theory. I've heard it called a spiritual creation. And after that was a physical creation using imperfect matter. So I think that many of you are Mormons. You have talked in your own religion about that kind of concept. So to that extent, we agree. I think that you will find that my teachings are a foundation for many religious thoughts, such as this one. Therefore, we can have a hierarchy, and that hierarchy in creation is the soul is greater than the body, because the soul is closer to the form. And the body is less perfect because it always changes. So now, what is perfection? I think we can agree that perfection is the pinnacle of existence. God is perfect, and therefore we see that pinnacle up there. And all perfection is at the pinnacle of existence. And by definition, if it changes, if it decays, if it rots, if it does anything, then it must fall from that position of perfection. We call that, obviously, imperfection. So isn't it true that a perfect thing, like the form, cannot change? Yes.
Could continuing improvement be part of perfection? I mean, can something that is perfect push itself higher to a higher level of perfection, like even though it might have started out perfect in the first place?
Well, yes, it could, provided it doesn't change. Because change itself means that it must become imperfect. Okay? Let me ask you this. Does something physical change? Here is a tractor. Has it changed? Let's have a vote. All of you who think that this tractor has changed from its original sense, raise your hand. Okay, I think that's almost all. Is passion always the same? How many of you have been angry at your computer? Okay. Can you stay angry forever? Not at the same level, right? Not at the same level. Therefore, can passion last forever, or does it also change? How many of you think that passion must change? Raise your hands. Okay. Therefore, nothing that is perfect can be made of physical matter, and nothing that is perfect can have emotions or passions. Because those are absolutely undeniable, then we can say without any question, God, who is perfect, cannot have a physical body or emotions. How many of you see the logic in that? Raise your hands. There is a religion that says God is without body parts or passions. How many of you have ever heard of that religion? Is that religion true? Is that statement true? God is a form, perhaps the keeper of all forms. And as the keeper of forms, he is perfect. He is absolutely perfect, and therefore cannot change, and cannot have a body, and cannot have emotions. Why did I take the toga off? What's it? Because my wife walked in. Yes, no. Why did I take my toga off?
So you can speak truth.
What's that?
So you can speak truth.
Because I could speak truth.
So now you can speak truth.
Have I not spoken truth? What has not been true? What has not been true?
You believed what you said was true, but basically, who's to say it wasn't just your opinion?
Let me ask you something. You say it's opinion, but is it logical? Say again? It is logical, you say? Religion's not logical? Okay. How can God be perfect and be consistent with LDS views? How many of you are LDS? How many of you believe that God is without body parts and passions? So how do you make God perfect and also have a body, a physical body, and also have... Can someone name a passion that God has? Love. Love. How can God have the passion of love and still be logical in all of our concepts? Yes.
When we think about humans being changeable, they have bodies that change and they have emotions that change. But when we think about God, he does have a body, but it's a body that never changes. And he has emotions, but his emotions are consistent, not like ours.
So you're saying that his love doesn't change and his body doesn't change. So is he made of the same stuff that we're made of? Yes.
If you follow this same kind of thinking, then I guess you could say that God's form is the form of things. For example, emotions. We don't understand how that could be because we don't experience the kind of emotions that he experiences. We're imperfect, and we have imperfect abilities. If we were to become a more perfect form of ourselves, we could experience his perfect emotions and understand them.
So what you're saying is that he has emotions, but they are different from our emotions because his are perfect and ours are imperfect. Just as I mentioned, he has a body, but it's a perfect kind of body that is different from our body. Let me suggest, how many of you remember the story of Christ after the resurrection coming to visit the apostles in a closed room? He came through the wall, right? He just appeared through the wall. Now, I have a wall here. Who would like to appear through this wall? Anybody volunteer to run through this wall for me? Is your body right now like Christ's resurrected body? There must be something different. Must be something. Some have said that it might be a plateau of perfectness. That's exactly the concept that this gentleman said. That God's emotions, or was it the young lady? God's emotions reach a plateau of perfection. He always loves us. Always. It goes for eternity. And therefore, there's no reason for his love to change since it is total, complete, eternal, and perfect. Yes, please.
When you say maybe it's not, I don't know, maybe his body wasn't that much different from ours. Maybe he just understood laws of nature. So he knew things that we don't, and that gave him abilities we don't have. It was just his understanding of things.
I grant you that. It may be that his body is like ours. Certainly it's tangible. You can feel it. The apostles felt it. But he understood laws that would allow him to pass through a wall. And so it may be a greater knowledge in the use of his body. And I give you that. That might equally be true.
So what this causes me to think about, and I don't know the exact reference, but there's this place in the Doctrine and Covenants that says the earth will be celestialized because it was continually perfect. It didn't deviate from its perfectness. So in that sense, perfection is doing what you're designed to do. You know, it doesn't mean it doesn't change ever. It just means that it perfectly fills the measure of its creation. So it might fluctuate, but it still meets its purpose.
Good. So let's just point that, and let me get back to that fulfilling its purpose. Christ fulfilled his purpose, and he said, "Be therefore perfect," in the Bible, but in the Book of Mormon, he said, "Be therefore perfect as I and my Father are perfect." He included himself in that perfection because he had fulfilled his purpose. So one definition of perfection is fulfillment. It can be an eternal perspective where you go forever and not necessarily be limited in a plateau concept, but you just keep on going. And that could be perfect as well. What's the mission of a clock? Tell time, right? So now the question is, does a perfect clock change? Does a perfect clock, do the hands on a perfect clock move? They have to move, don't they? If it's to be perfect, it must change. Therefore, the clock, the perfect clock, must move to be perfect. Therefore, God, to be perfect, could have some movement, some change, some way of being perfect, and not necessarily always exactly the same. He could have a body, he could have passions. What's our mission? To learn. We don't learn everything, but we learn. Also to experience with a body, but we don't experience everything. To obey, but we realize that sometimes we might not obey. And to repent, which is to fix when we don't obey. This is why we came to this earth. And all of those are steps toward fulfilling our purpose here. Remember that when the clock stops moving, you have to put a battery in it. That's like repentance. So repentance to a clock is putting a battery in. I like that. I think that's good, you know. Latter-day Saints seem to have a different definition of perfection when applied to God and when applied to people in general. Let me tell you the problem that I'm talking about here. We all accept that God has a body and that he has passions. And yet, when we look at ourselves and compare to others, we sometimes criticize our imperfections. So we are not willing to apply the standard of improvement to ourselves. We can't say to ourselves, gee, I'm getting better, and be happy with that. We always look at ourselves and all we can see is the imperfections rather than the improvements. My caution is that by so doing, you defeat your own self-image. What you want to do is just keep marching along, putting batteries in your clock so that you keep trying to tell perfect time. For God, they do not accept Plato's definition. We all agree that that's not right. For people, they use Plato's definition that perfection means anything less than perfect. Why apply that to yourselves and not to God? Therefore, we get frustrations and self-depreciation. Much better to have progress as the key to this life. So we can be, in fact, perfect in our progression. And then when we make a mistake, we repent, we put a battery in, and we can keep progressing. Doesn't mean that we have to be up here on the level, but we can keep going up the hill. Now, why do Christians accept Plato's definition? The reason, and we'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity. But for this, let me read this to you. In 325, Constantine summoned the Christian leaders from all over the empire to a council at Nicaea, it's modern Iznik in Turkey, on the shores of the Sea of Marmara. These leaders believed in widely differing interpretations of the scriptures, but Constantine browbeat them into accepting an official line on such matters as the divinity of Christ and his equality with God. This was essentially a political move, enabling Constantine to strengthen his hold on the empire by merging the power of the church with that of the state. We then had the imperial church. It was the church not headed by a pope, not headed by a patriarch. It was headed by the emperor of Rome. And he was able to make decisions about that church based upon political as well as religious things. And that's the reason that the Christians adopted that concept of God, because it was approved in the Council of Nicaea by Constantine. He threw his support behind that definition. When he did that, people were forced to accept it. If you did not, you were declared a heretic and you might be killed, and many were. Therefore, by definition, the concept of God without body parts and passions occurred because the emperor made it mandatory. That's why Mormons are not Christians today, because the emperor in 325 said so. Now, we know that Mormons are Christians because we believe in Christ. But that's not the definition of the world at large. The world at large says, if you don't believe in the Nicene Creed, then you cannot be a Christian because Constantine said so in 325 AD. He said, God is a Trinity, God is without body parts or passions. But some people are starting to chafe at that. C.S. Lewis, a good man, he was a traditional Christian. He said, what soul ever perished from believing that God the Father really has a beard? Isn't that a fun way to say it? Let me read you something a little more modern. There are 3 books that I found very, very fascinating in this area. One of them is called The God Who Risks. The second, The Openness of God. And the third was a BYU Studies article where several of these new Protestant philosophers were quoted and studied. Let me now read you a couple of quotations from philosophers or they're actually ministers of various Protestant faiths who have trouble believing the concept of the Nicene Creed. Let's see what they say. Who God is does not change, but what God experiences does change. So too, God is not impassible, that is, without emotion, as the tradition has mostly insisted. These ministers are actually saying God is not impassible. So he's saying God does have emotions. Another one. Maybe corporeality is a funny idea to many Christians and not one that we can easily entertain, but why rule it out when it has scriptural backing? And it does. I'm in the middle of reading the Old Testament right now. And all over the place, it says that God has a body. And yet it's been ruled out because of decisions made in the early Christian church. Latter-day Saints are entitled to a bit of "we told you so" to more traditional Christians. Isn't that a wonderful admission by these ministers? LDS point of view. God's body is not like our earthly body. It can pass through walls and does not decay. Both of those things are perhaps different from our current bodies. Certainly the decay part. Next, we should not give others the impression that we believe that God has a body like ours. We must say God has a glorified body. And Christians will accept some kind of glorification for God much more easily than they would a body like you and I have got. So we've got to be a little careful in our words to bring over the Christian sects. And finally, when stated thusly, the gap between LDS and the open God beliefs narrows significantly. They are moving towards us. They are willing to accept a little "I told you so" from us. But we can be a little careful in our wording so that we don't lead them into a belief of God that we ourselves don't even believe in. We must be careful to say what we truly believe. The King Follett Discourse. God himself was once as we are now, and is an exalted man, and sits enthroned in yonder heavens. That is the great secret. If the veil were rent today and the great God who holds this world in its orbit and who upholds all worlds and all things by his power was to make himself visible, I say if you were to see him today, you would see him like a man in form, like yourselves in all the person, image, and very form as a man. Now, I don't know if Joseph Smith intentionally used form because of some knowledge of Plato, but it is interesting that he uses that word to describe God's situation. Again, from other Christian leaders, we have not felt comfortable saying that humans become gods, as Latter-day Saints had, even though we know that early Christians did speak of our human destiny in such terms. Sacred Scripture affirms that God is both able and willing to transform us into his likeness. Why then should we call such transformation impossible or even qualify God's promises in ways he does not? In other words, if God chooses to make us perfect as he is, who's to say he can't do it? And that is a radical admission by these Protestant ministers. I think we should be aware of their movement, albeit very slow. Thank you, everybody. Let's take a 5-minute break. Come on back. We'll talk about philosophy again.